this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of your cognitive limitations. The purpose is for you to understand your cognitive abilities properly, for you to understand what you're capable of doing, for you to be able to understand how far you can push your cognitive abilities and take advantage of them properly. And there are 7 main factors that we're going to be talking about for you to understand everything you need to know and how to apply that when it comes to speed reading, of course. First factor is the amount of information you're receiving. Let's take an example. If you're trying to read and understand a 1,000-word passage in 10 minutes, in contrast, where you have 30 minutes for the same passage, you will most likely be able to understand, retain, and get a lot more out of the passage when you have 30 minutes than when you have 10 minutes. And the reason why is because of information processing. Information processes has kind of 2 sides to it. First, how long you spent trying to process the information that you have. And second is the amount of information itself. Sometimes the amount of information is so great that you cannot do it and you cannot process it in a certain amount of time. And one of the main factors that influence this is our short-term memory. Our short-term memory is limited. If you read a 200-word passage right now, your short-term memory will not be able to process and retain and eventually memorize most of this passage. You might be able to retain and understand some ideas, but you most probably won't be able to memorize the entire passage word by word because of the limitations of your short-term memory. It is a resource that is accessible at any point. However, it is limited. You cannot have as much short-term memory as you want. There's kind of a limit that you will get to at one point, and you need to realize if this amount of information that you're trying to process is enough for your short-term memory and your cognitive processing ability to go through with or not. Which brings us to the other factor, which is your exposure to information. Time and information mixed up together will kind of make this combination that will show you if the exposure was effective or not. And of course, other factors would step in when it comes to exposure, such as your concentration and your attention at the time when you were trying to process the information. Again, if you read 1,000 passage word in 10 minutes and 1,000 passage words in 30 minutes, when in the 30 minutes you were not concentrated at all, and in the 10 minutes you're highly concentrated, you'll be able to get a lot more out of the 10 minutes than the 30 minutes because of other exposure factors that kind of influence your cognitive processing ability. Third is your attention span. So this is something we kind of talked about before. You need to realize that yes, you're able to concentrate on something for a specific amount of time, and the more you work on improving your concentration, the more and longer you'll be able to concentrate on specific things. However, our attention span is at the end of the day limited. You will get to a point where your attention will be shifted towards something else and you will lose concentration. This is also one of the limitations that you need to keep in mind. If you are reading something and you feel like your attention keeps shifting towards something else, you need to realize that this is natural. Of course, there are solutions. Maybe there's specific things that's always grabbing your attention. It can be your phone right next to the book you're reading. Whenever it goes off, your attention goes towards it. This is something that you can eliminate. However, in the long run, your attention span is at the end of the day limited, and you need to keep that in mind as one of the cognitive processing limitations that you have. Another factor comes from understanding our long-term memory. Our short-term memory that we previously talked about is limited. However, your long-term memory is a bit more tricky. When it comes to long-term memory, you have a lot more flexibility. When you have a lot of time to process a certain amount of information, you are able to kind of store that in your long-term memory. If you have a 200-word passage that you're trying to memorize word by word, short-term memory, you might be able to retain it in, let's say, half an hour, but 2 days later, you'll forget most of it. But if you spend 2 hours to make sure that it's encoded in your long-term memory, then 2 months later, you'll be able to see that you probably remember most of the passage still. And the reason why is because your long-term memory is much more effective than your short-term memory. So you gotta understand that there are some limitations for your short-term memory that can be solved with your long-term memory. But the limitations to your long-term memory is that it takes more time for you to process the information, and it also highly influenced by the exposure that you had when you were trying to encode this information. Another factor to keep in mind is emotional factors. Stress and anxiety, depression, they can make your brain kind of foggy. You might not be able to focus. Let's say if you are usually able to focus for 30 minutes straight without losing your concentration when you're reading a passage, and you're going through a stressful time, you're going through exams, or you're going through any kind of stressful situations, you might find that your attention span is going to become a bit less than what you expected. Your concentration span will be a bit less than what you usually expected or what you're used to, because there's something that's kind of going through your head that's moving your concentration from something towards something else. Our emotional state can have a big influence on our cognitive processing ability. When you're in an emotional state where you feel motivated, inspired, happy, joyful, you'll find sometimes that you're able to concentrate even more than you used to be able to before because of the emotional factors. And if you're depressed, if you have a lot of stress and anxiety, you'll find that you are able to focus less than what you're used to before because of these emotional factors. And this is, of course, a limitation. At the same time, it can be much more than that. It can be something you can take to your advantage if you use your emotional processing and you become emotionally intelligent and you use your emotions properly to guide you towards success. Which leaves us with the two last limitations. First is the information pace. How fast can you kind of process the information? Of course, the information itself is one thing, the exposure is another thing, but the mix together, which forms your personal attitude and cognitive processing ability towards the information, can be somewhere that you only know. As we said, you might be able to concentrate on a certain amount of information for 30 minutes. This is an individual estimate that you need to figure out. But you need to keep in mind that what is the information pace that works best for you to get the best out of the information, at the same time keep your concentration up there to be able to actually concentrate on what you're doing and get the best out of it. And lastly, motivation. It can be also one of the limiting factors, because if you're doing something and you're not motivated, you're doing something that you hate, you're doing something that you're not enjoying, you usually have a tendency to lose your concentration and go do something that you enjoy doing. This can be reflected in procrastination. It can be reflected in a lot of different factors when you have a lack of motivation towards the object you're trying to focus on. Motivation can definitely be a limitation. At the same time, as we said when we were talking about emotional factors, motivation can also be helpful, because when you find the motivation to work on something specific, or you kind of boost your motivation, you'll find yourself that you're able to focus and concentrate on whatever you're trying to do more. You'll be able to find that the information processing and the cognitive processing abilities overall are even better than what you expected. So keeping these 7 limitation factors in mind, these 7 cognitive limitation factors are crucial for you to understand your cognitive ability and be able to tap into it whenever you want, have it accessible, and at the same time understand it from a way that once you encounter a limitation, you understand that this is a limitation and you know that you need to cope with it one way or another. And of course, throughout this course, we're going to be looking into how to deal with each and every one of these limitations. Some of them cannot be completely erased. Some of them you'll be able to work on them and kind of improve them, and others you'd be able to just move them away and solve the issue completely.